Hello, everyone who's joining us for this Climate Festival event. I'm going to leave it a few minutes, just until a few seconds even, as more people join. So the event's being recorded. We can communicate with each other on this call using the Q&A function at the top of the Teams app. We'll take questions at the end of Alex's talk, but if a question does occur to you during the session, by all means, type it in the chat so there's not a rush at the end. I'll say a few words of introduction and then I'll hand over to Alex. I can see more people are joining us. So my name's Dr. Steve Willey. I'm the Academic Co-Director of Environmental Education Projects here at Birkbeck. And on behalf of the Birkbeck Climate Festival, I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's event. Across the festival, we've been really excited to offer such a diverse range of topics and conversations, all programmed with the aim of fostering interdisciplinary thinking about climate change and exploring solutions to some of the most pressing environmental challenges we face. Tonight's talk is titled Just Transitions in Urban Food Systems, and it's being delivered by Professor Alex Colas of International Relations in the School of Social Sciences at Birkbeck. And this is one of many talks across the festival that's been organised in collaboration with the Birkbeck Research Centre in Environment and Sustainability. Alex directs the MSc in International Security and Global Governance and the MSc in Food Politics and Society. He's a brilliant speaker and we're really excited to have him. Alex, thank you very much for giving your time to the Climate Festival in amongst all your other responsibilities. I'm going to put myself on mute now, but I'll come back at the end if that's useful to chair the conversation that we'll hopefully get in the Q&A, but I'll hand over to you. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Stephen, and thanks very much to my colleagues from the Birkbeck Centre for Environment and Sustainability, and not least to all of you that have joined this call online as it is. As I look out the window, maybe you get a chance to as well. We've had a first spring day and this is the tail end of it, so I appreciate that. I'm just going to put the screen on to share, and let me just make sure this is working. Hopefully, Stephen, can you, is it showing?
It's not showing yet, but it was before, so
okay, let me see if I've done something wrong here, because it may well be. Is that working at all?
No.
No, okay. Just bear with me.
But yeah, I think you're still trying to share the screen, Alex.
Yes. Sorry,
it was working. No, it's okay. It was working before, so I'm sure it's just a temporary glitch.
Here we are. I think it was my fault. Apologies. That should be working now.
Yes, we can see the slides.
Right. Thanks for your technical patience. So my starting point is that there's millions of meals eaten every day in London in public. And when I say in public, I'm thinking of hospitals, prisons, schools, but also those of us that come into work, and that either in the neighborhood, if we get to move outside our offices, or if we're stuck in workplaces in canteens, or what is passes for canteens. That everyday fact means that there's a great opportunity in a city like London, a global city like London, of around 10 million people, to make an intervention into the climate crisis through the food system. Cities are obviously destinations of what is a much more complex agro-food system, but it's that opening thought really that is the source of my interest in this theme, and which I want to talk to in about 30 minutes or so, hopefully giving plenty of time for discussion. But I'm going to start with a little bit of context and a few caveats, because the context of this thinking is, in my case, linked to work that I've been doing with the Food and Work Network, and a group of academics across the UK, trade union, particularly the Bakers Food and Allied Workers Union, but also allied organizations like Unite that have membership in the food sector, and also importantly campaigning groups and advocacy groups, of which there are many and very powerful ones in the United Kingdom linked to the food system. And this Food and Work Network has as its name very obviously suggests, it focuses on the place of food in workplaces and the place of food workers in the wider economy. One of the themes that's come out is this idea of a just transition. And it's, as I'll explain, the just transition, many of you may know on the call, originally comes from the labor movement, the notion of the justice in the transition towards a more decarbonized world. But my thinking around this has been inspired through conversations with the group of people that perhaps I'm not sure how well you can see us in the bottom right of this image, are concerned with the food system because they work in it, but also concerned with all kinds of effects of the climate crisis that we're living with, not just as workers, but oftentimes as consumers themselves. So I'm going to be focusing, and these are the caveats, on London. I'm not going to be talking about cities, and there are, of course, many differences between the global north and the global south, between cities that may have a post-colonial or post-imperial experience like London, and those that do not. There's all kinds of nuances that are going to be lost in what I have to say, mainly because I'm going to be focusing on London, although the context, again, of this research, which hasn't been done, and this is another important caveat, what I'm presenting to you is my initial thoughts on how to organize possible research that I and my colleagues in Istanbul, a colleague called Candan Turkan, who has written extensively on Istanbul's food provisioning system. We're trying to pull these ideas together in various funding bids. We haven't been lucky thus far, so if there's any funders out there listening to this, we'd be very keen to talk to you. But that aside, this is a very, it's at its inception stage, this thinking about just food transition in urban food systems. So I'm going to say something in just a moment about what is specific about the urban condition in this notion of just transitions, maybe giving a quick oversight on how I'm approaching the notion of just transitions, and then say a little bit about what is the justice in the transition, and then finally closing with what is the transition in the justice. So as you can see, there are emphases on different aspects of this notion of a just transition. Now, to start off with cities themselves, food is widely recognized as being central to any move towards a just transition. It is clear that the global agri-food system accounts for up to possibly more than a third of current greenhouse gas emissions, and it is a critical contributor, the food system is, to biodiversity loss, as well as all kinds of other negative environmental externalities. And because large cities, as I was saying, particularly in the global north, remain the final destination for the transnational food supply chains, consuming much of the produce grown, reared, processed elsewhere, oftentimes in very distant elsewheres, global cities therefore have to be focal point in efforts for a just transition. And through the decades, urban food stakeholders, I'll come back to that notion, have been keenly aware of this reality. All kinds of initiatives have mushroomed across different parts of the world, community gardens, permaculture, urban agriculture initiatives, alternative food networks, farmers markets, all those kinds of things on the one hand, and on the other hand, perhaps moving upscale a little bit, food sovereignty, agroecology, small family farms, the idea of re-peasantization, and back to the land movements across different parts of the world, including peri-urban movements. All of these have formed part of discussions and activities around the just transition. But I suppose what I want to think about is how these different stakeholders conceive of, or might conceive of, what a just transition is. Thus far, the notion of a just transition has operated mainly, as it were, upstream in the energy sectors, in the production sectors, transport to a certain extent, so mainly around scope 3 areas. And insofar as the agri-food system has been concerned with decarbonization, it has also been mainly focused again upstream in the scope 3 areas, and yet cities mainly are concerned with scope 1 and 2 considerations, certainly urban food stakeholders. And just as an illustration, this is merely an illustration of how this plays out. This are food retailers or grocery retailers in the American version, presented by McKinsey. And you can see that in terms of the different areas where grocery retailers might be able to contribute towards a just transition, we're looking at material uses in packaging, switches in logistics. Mainly focused around scope 1, with some areas around scope 2 and 3. The way I'm going to think of just transition is quite capaciously. I mean, there is an understanding of just transition in its origins that was merely about.
Alex,
yes.
Sorry to interrupt. We had a comment in the Q&A, and it is true that the slides weren't changing. I think that's because you're not in presenter mode. I thought they might have changed anyway. So you know the icon down at the bottom, you just need to. That's the one, and then we'll be able to follow.
My apologies.
That's not gone to a large screen though. Will you try it one more time?
Yeah, apologies for that. Right. Is that better?
It's not gone to a full screen of presentation.
Right.
I think, but it has changed slide.
All right. Okay.
So I guess the choice is to just click down the slides if we can't get it to be a full screen.
Yeah. I mean, let's give it one more try. That hasn't. That's not a big screen, is it?
No.
Okay, my apologies. It's probably my.
But that is changing now as you move down like that. That is changing the slides, so we can at least see the slides as you move through them. Sorry to interrupt. But
not at all. Thank you for pointing that out, because I think these slides hopefully help to make more sense of what I'm going to be talking about. So I was saying that my conception of a just transition is quite capacious. There are narrower understandings of just transitions. In the 1980s and even into the 90s, it was mainly about making sure that there were no job losses, or the terms and conditions of those involved, particularly, as I was saying, the energy sector or heavy industry moving, decarbonizing, weren't left behind, so to speak. But I think there's more capacious understandings of what a just transition is, and I want to align myself to those, which are that it's fundamentally about mitigating the effects of climate change, such as extreme weather, sea level rise, biodiversity loss for wider populations. And a just transition therefore involves decarbonizing the economy whilst protecting livelihoods and reducing existing social inequalities and injustices. So in the context of an urban food system, this requires drastically reducing carbon emissions whilst narrowing food inequalities and increasing food security for the bulk of urban or peri-urban populations. This is a socio-economic transition. It's not merely a sectorial one. And this is relevant because if we look at conceptions of food systems, and in particular urban food systems, here I'm going to draw from two food theorists. One is Walden Belasco, who speaks about the food triangle, the triangulation between identity, convenience, and responsibility in any food system. And I've added some categories to this. Hopefully you can see them. I'm happy to share these slides afterwards and speak to them later if necessary. But I've added the notion of culture, of the private sphere, of the household to identity, and of economics, the market, corporations to convenience, and finally politics, public sphere and government to responsibility. Walden Bello suggests that there's always a trade-off between these three elements of the food system: the way we produce, the way we consume, the way we dispose of food across the food chain, has elements, and of responsibility, identity, and convenience, and there's always a tension between these. And I'm transposing these to Caroline Steele's groundbreaking, fantastic work, right from her early book Hungry City to her latest book on Sitopia, to her understanding of this place, the Dobos, that is a food utopia. And I think that this is not her formulation, but I've borrowed it, that somewhere in the middle of this Venn diagram of environmental responsibility and sustainability, of cultural identity that manages diversity and change, and of socioeconomic convenience that allows for some degree of stability, some degree of food security, somewhere in the middle of that Venn diagram is the Sitopia, is a, well, I'm making new, I see what's going on here. Sorry, I think I'm editing my own slides as they go along, but we got there. So hopefully the slide here, you can see if we superimpose Walden Bellows triangulation to the notion of Sitopia, somewhere in the center of that Venn diagram is where I think just transition sits. So in order to conceptualize just transition in urban food systems, I think we've got to, or I want to, think about this tension and attempts at reconciling responsibility, identity, and convenience. As I was saying, this is not new. There are thankfully many bodies, including international bodies like the International Labour Organization, that are starting to think about what is just transitions in a broader sense, in the more capacious way that I was saying. And I won't quote this directly, but you can see here from the 2015 guidelines on just transitions towards environmentally sustainable economies and societies, that understanding of greening enterprises and jobs, but also reconciling that with sustainability, innovation, resilience. So as you can see, there's an attempt here to think about just transition, about squaring off those trade-offs, or at least putting them front and center of any considerations around just food transition. So let me now move on to what is just about a transition in the urban food systems. What are the conceptions of justice that may be relevant to our considerations? And here again, I'm borrowing unashamedly from colleagues across the road from where I sit anyhow at UCL, that have compiled some years ago 4 conceptions of justice. These are not exhaustive, but I think they're very helpful in trying to think through what is the justice element. There are procedural dimensions, which public bodies and private interests are responsible for conducting, framing, and indeed enforcing a just transition. In my trade in politics, the inevitable political question is ultimately who has the proper authority to enforce particular regulations, particular patterns, or conceptions of justice. And here I'm going to bring in just a moment considerations of scale as well as proper authority. If we want to match this to the Venn diagram that I was showing earlier, I think these procedural considerations link up to notions of responsibility. There are clearly in any theories of justice questions of distribution and indeed redistribution. I think these are allied to economic, socioeconomic redistribution, and they attach to Walden Belasco's notions of convenience for all kinds of reasons that I'll identify in just a moment. One of our central problems in urban food systems in particular is time, the allocation of time poverty, particularly by workers, urban food workers, and those that are outside of the food system. The fact that we need convenience foods, the fact that we have little time. I would throw out there, just for sake of discussion, that although skills are often highlighted as being one source of food insecurity, and in other instances it is about appliance poverty, and that's absolutely a consideration. I would venture that time is of the essence, and that time poverty, both at work, and then in the periods getting to and from work, all of this eats up, excuse the punnery, time, so that the sort of disposable time available to households, or even for those of us that are in workplaces, to actually cook, to prepare, to plan for, to feed, and then clear up proper nourishing food is very limited. Even in the workplace, how many of us now actually take a lunch hour? The lunch hour has disappeared, certainly in this country. So there's issues of convenience there, and considerations of food justice about valuing food and food work, both paid and unpaid, in the workplace, in the household, in the community. All of these are considerations around the redistribution of food, and I'll come back to possible transitions thinking about food procurement values and of universality. Thirdly, there's an understanding of justice which is concerned with identity and with recognition. Who and what counts as an urban food stakeholder? I flagged this earlier on. Across different initiatives in different parts of the world, there's been several decades now of experience in food councils in North America. Thankfully now in the United Kingdom, many metropolitan areas, London boroughs and others, have food strategies or their equivalents. And these are the public authorities, but do they have the resources? Should they be the repositories of food strategies? Can those food strategies, and should they be implemented by local authorities? Should they be metropolitan authorities, regional authorities? What responsibility for the national government, or indeed devolved government? So here the question of scale starts to creep up. But equally, there's a consideration of the role of the private sector and markets in recognizing these different forms of food stakeholder and understanding how the residual time, or the protected time that I was referring to in the household, also applies to workplaces. How much time do workplaces offer for their own employees in order for them to get nourishing commensality, an actual experience of eating not just nourishing food, but in a fairly enjoyable and restful way? What do canteens look like? What is the food offer in workplaces? These are, I think, questions around recognition of urban dwellers and workers in particular. And what is the culturally appropriate food available in all those places, in workplaces, households, and communities? And finally, there is a conception of justice that is about restoration or reparation, about reducing the likelihood of future harm of future generations through thinking about the legacies of whatever interventions we conduct now. If one thing we all know in the climate crisis is that the temporalities of climate crisis, both in terms of the great acceleration, the way in which greenhouse gas emissions and the climate crisis has been concentrated in a very specific moment in industrial capitalism, and the ways in which the slow violence, to coin the phrase, is experienced in different parts of the world at different temporalities, and indeed, as I was saying, future generations. All of this has to be baked in, excuse the punnery again, into considerations of, for instance, the consequences, potential unintended future consequences of, say, green gentrification, the introduction of urban food gardens or of urban food initiatives that might unwittingly, as has happened occasionally with greening of urban spaces, lead to an increase in house prices or a form of gentrification that actually hurts those very communities that need and deserve some form of reparation or restoration. Similarly, there are pitfalls in these attempts at moving at decarbonizing, moving away from a meat dairy kind of diet, which is manifestly one of the key tools in a just food transition, there are dangers of consumer stigmatization, of forgetting that pubs or chicken shops also have a social value in their own way. So with these four main conceptions of justice, which are obviously not incompatible, but they frame, in my mind, the complexities, the trade-offs, the ways, the interconnections between procedure, distribution, recognition, and restoration in urban settings. So let me move on now towards the understanding of how these conceptions of justice then play into what is it about the transitional element of this just transition in urban food systems. What would a transition look like? Where is Cytopia, if you like, and what might it look like? And I'm interested, because of the particularities of urban food, of the urban condition in places, but also processes where responsibility, convenience, and identity, or indeed sustainability, stability, and change, those remember the triangulation in the Venn diagram that I was referring to, where these converge into a just transition towards some kind of Cytopia. Now, to her credit, Caroline Steele, and I'm going to refer to her, I'm going to quote her at length in just a moment, just so you get a flavor, speaks very specifically about the types of what a Cytopia would look like. She has also mainly written about London, but she speaks of designing a city through food and says, well, what might it look like? It would have strong links with its local hinterland through a lattice-like food network, with active markets, local shops, a strong sense of food identity. Its houses would be built with large, comfortable kitchens. Their local school with kids would teach kids about food, and children would learn to grow and cook from an early age. Above all, she says the city would celebrate food, use it as to bring people together. The architecture could be as modern as you like, but it would not all be designed to build at once. These are the quotes from her book, Hungry City, and they sketch out very briefly some of the keywords that Caroline Steele associated to her place Cytopia. Now, I want to again riff off that and suggest that an urban just transition would include these kinds of things. Firstly, socially and environmentally regulated public food procurement. Food procurement is central in combining the various elements of responsibility, convenience, and identity. We all have to eat, or ideally we should all be able to eat 3 times a day. Some of those meals will be in public spaces, in workplaces. Many of those hundreds of thousands of daily meals that I was referring to, or the millions of meals I was referring to in a city, but a significant proportion of that will be in hospitals, in care homes, in schools, in prisons. And much of the food being dished out in those public arenas will be served or will have been paid for through taxpayer funding, through public procurement. So I think there's a place here for thinking about the ways in which environmental regulations, in socially responsible ways of using taxpayers' money can be attached to those billions of pounds that are spent every year on this public food procurement. I think this can also involve ethically or environmentally friendly supply chains. So we can conceive of, as many places are already, both in London and elsewhere, about workplace canteens, about neighborhood voucher schemes in workplaces where we might be able to have part of our pay presented or offered by our employees to spend it in local neighborhood restaurants that are socially and environmentally friendly, to think about schools, hospitals, prisons, etc., as places where we can harness what Kevin Morgan in a recent terrific book, Come Manifesto, has called the public plate, to use this purchasing power of the public plate in achieving just transitions. I think, secondly, universal free school meals, as we're seeing now in London and in Wales, and of which there's plenty of evidence internationally, have a great developmental and educational value, which generates a virtuous cycle between nutrition, school attendance, academic attainment. There's all kinds of ways in which this is an investment, not just in the health and the education and the personal development of future generations, but it's also a place where the notion of just transition can be emplaced literally in food learning moments, in changing food habits, learning how to share the public plate, to learning to be part of this commensality, and to think about the diversity in urban food settings within schools. It will also, in my mind, open up tricky questions, but ones that need to be addressed, around the recognition of catering staff, of cooking staff in schools, to almost make, if you like, if libraries rightly are the center of learning places, be they schools, universities, further education colleges, there's every reason why canteens and food areas should also be central to that, because they are the places, especially in educational settings, in school settings, where all kinds of learning moments and public procurement elements can come together in literally in a single place. So here again, responsibility, convenience, and identity come together, and the universality of free school meals has been demonstrated to be redistributive. So again, in that very practice of eating together in a public sphere, there is an opportunity for redistributing unequal food inequalities, especially for those most vulnerable, which and those who are developing, which are children and indeed young adults. Community restaurants, thirdly, and urban farms, urban agroecology more broadly, can and I think are a means of recognizing what scholars call food work in the household. All that planning, those skills, that knowledge, overwhelmingly, not exclusively, of course, but overwhelmingly displayed and conducted by women in the household or in the wider community, can, I think, be harnessed through remunerated work in the public sphere or in the third sector or through civil society, through growing or communal eating initiatives. There's plenty of examples, commonplace examples, certainly in faith groups. One thinks of Sikh Gurdwaras, one thinks of all kinds of festivals. I mean, we're going through Ramadan currently, and of course the iftar is a perfect example of a communal eating moment that can bring notions of just transition in this instance in a holy month. But we can learn a great deal about this, those of us that are secular or in secular settings of multi-faith or no faith, how community restaurants and urban growing areas are not just sites of changing our, shortening our supply chains and changing our food habits, but also very importantly, including recognizing the role of food in creating diverse, cosmopolitan, genuinely cosmopolitan urban settings like London. They can help to reduce food miles, to shorten supply chains, to address aspects of packaging, and indeed this transition to more plant-based diets. And all of these are linked into culturally appropriateness and inclusivity of urban food systems. So very much within the recognition side of justice. And finally, I'm bound to say, and with this I'll finish, and apologies again for the technical issues with the slides, food workers themselves, the food sector themselves, from seasonal fruit pickers, many of them working in peri-urban context, to kitchen porters, fisher folk, to food delivery riders, all of these need to be recognized and compensated as critical workers. This is another major trade-off. If we are to value our food system more, it is likely that we will have to pay more for it. And if that payment isn't to be inflationary and isn't to hit those populations, lower income populations, who incidentally are more dependent on meat and dairy for their income because it's more accessible and often cheaper than plant-based offer, then we have to think of subsidies, we have to think of price controls. These are controversial political interventions, public authority interventions into the private sphere, but they require thinking about politically about empowering food workers, allowing them to unionize, allowing them to organize, to improve their work terms and conditions, including some instances transition-related themes in the shop floor, like temperatures. I mean, the Bakers Union in particular, admittedly not working mainly, most of their plants are not in urban areas or near where, though near where I live in Brent, there is 80% of hummus, supermarket hummus, is produced, I'm told, in Park Royal Estate by Bakkavor. And issues of temperature are real issues as summer or certain seasons become hotter, temperatures rise as well. And these are considerations. Irregular working patterns, poor pay, these are intimately connected to food justice insofar as the possibilities of transitioning to a more plant-based diet, for instance, or being more involved in shorter supply chains, are intimately connected to the types of shift work that food workers in particular have to deal with, and the distances in transport, all the kinds of ways in which the working week intervenes in the availability of that disposable time I was referring to earlier, to actually plan, prepare, cook, feed, and clear up afterwards. Who has time to do that if just getting to and from work requires that planning and that, you know, an hour's time, if in the workplace your food offer is quite limited. So initiatives like incorporating last mile logistics into the wider public food delivery systems amongst less mobile populations, for instance, or introducing canteens in more and more workplaces, allowing for that lunch hour to return, and having places near or in work where healthy, nutritious, sustainable, and socially responsibly procured food is readily available at affordable prices. That, for me, is an integral component of Sitopia. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention. And I've been instructed, and I will do so now finally, to refer you to the feedback form. Maybe we can put this on the chat as well. We'd welcome your feedback from this whole festival, which, as I say, again, I'm very grateful to have given the opportunity to try out some of these ideas, which, as you can see, are still in formation and quite promissory.
Thank you so much, Alex. I have put a note in the Q&A inviting people to both feedback on this particular event and also ask you a question. There aren't any yet, but from experience, I was about to say there is one. There is one now. I was about to say from experience, sometimes it takes a couple of minutes for people to gather their thoughts. I've got lots of questions, but I have a privilege of getting to ask them to you at another time. So let's go to this one that's come up in the Q&A. Do you have any thoughts on any just transition initiatives would look like in large event spaces, such as large stadiums in cities? That's one of the questions there.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, it's a really good question, and it directs my mind to the role of private sector and of corporations in this. And as it happens, I don't know the detail of what would be the larger clubs who clearly have the resources, and but not just financial resources, but those a team dear to my heart, just because my daughter played for them, not because I'm a supporter, but Spurs. You know, there is a it's in Tottenham. it is in a socially very unequal and yet richly diverse part of London. And one can see immediately how the social responsibility towards that neighborhood would start off with maybe really investing in the staff that supply food at on match days or event days or whatever it may be. So I would apply all the principles of socially and environmentally responsible procurement, of ethical procurement, to that kind of setting. And I know that there are many enterprises that are now doing that, you know, from Wonky Veg to all kinds of outfits that in all kinds of ways try and recycle surplus food. I think that has to be part of the equation. That certainly has to be, from an analytical perspective, it fits as an academic, it fits with in that that procurement side of things. You know, how do we impact downstream on the further up the supply chain, and those institutions that have the economic resources, but also importantly, as I say, that identity, that sense of identity. You know, if Spurs becomes one of those big institutions that is able to think about the food that it serves as part and parcel of some kind of just transition as an institution, then you're already affecting literally the millions of consumers that will go through through their installations, their facilities. I hope that begins to address how I would think about that question.
Thanks, Alex. So the next question up is from James Thorpe, and they ask, how do the big food producers and retailers fit into a just transition?
Well, again, I think there's very basic stuff around recognizing workforces in terms of their role as critical workers. We saw during the pandemic how food workers were recognized as such, producing food, processing it, then if we're talking further down the chain in retail, putting it on shelves, and then even, you know, delivery riders going everywhere to make sure that those of us that were housebound, locked in, had some access to food. So there's every reason to keep that legacy going. And I think pay, terms and conditions, as I was saying, making the very places where food is produced and processed, including, by the way, restaurants or cafes, you know, the retail end of the spectrum, making this an industry where there is continuous professional development, where one can make a career and build some kind of lifelong commitment, build up skills. I think that's increasingly present in different parts of the sector, particularly in the retail sector. This idea that food is not an afterthought. It's not just about fuel that we have to ingest 3 times a day. It is, once more, central to the fabric of social life, especially in cities. It is critical if we are thinking about a just transition for reasons I've mentioned, but it's also importantly a joyful experience. It can be a source of commensality, of interaction. So I think workplaces, if we're talking about food producers specifically, sorry, James, I forgot if you were talking specifically about that. There is a old-fashioned, again, sorry for this, but bread and butter issues. Pay food workers properly. In a survey by the Bakers Union a couple of years ago, about 10% of their own workforce, of those who replied, and it was an extensive survey, were themselves food insecure. The very people who are producing the food cannot make ends meet, and they report that they themselves struggle to feed themselves properly. And overwhelming there is a cost of living dimension to that, but overwhelmingly the issue is around time. It's the lack of time, and the lack of time in absolute terms, in having long shifts, but also having irregular shifts, irregular patterns. And this is also reported the other end of the food spectrum, where maybe there's people on the call that know this in their own experience, but in retail and in restaurants and cafes, nightclubs in particular, you don't really get to eat, and if you eat, you don't eat very well. It's far and few places where, again, that old custom of having a pre-sitting, pre-service meal, a communal meal, still happens. And I think that is a political issue that is about consciousness raising, and ultimately might even be about organizing through unions across the sector.
Thanks, Alex. We have a bit more time for questions if you're okay to. We've got 10 minutes left, so absolutely. Perfect. So we have two from Anna Marina Colette, and I'll ask them together. They're in the chat. What is your view on the role of city networks? What should they be careful about when starting to engage with this transition? And then the second question is, what could impact investment in urban food systems look like, and how can cities get started?
Sorry, Steve, can you say that last bit? What kind of investment?
It says, what could impact investment in urban food systems look like, and how can cities get started? I think there's those are both from was it Nadia? Anna Marina College. Yeah.
I mean, in terms of city networks, if you're thinking about, I don't know if you're thinking about translocal networks, or you mean networks within cities, Anna? I guess you can't come in on this because
she might write in the chat in a minute.
Okay, sorry. I mean, let me go for one that I think applies to both instances, and that is something I mentioned in the talk, which is green gentrification, broadly conceived as the unintended consequences of interventions that are deemed to make different parts of the city greener, more sustainable, ecologically sound. We've seen in transport that there are trade-offs, there are tensions. Translocal networks, okay, thanks. But I think that is one area that is applies to food as well. There's any just transition, the justice part of it has to involve those very communities that are that live and work in areas that are being targeted. And I'm thinking here about urban food or urban growing initiatives. There are plenty of very good examples across London, for instance, where that is the case, where historically marginalized communities, folk who have a very long history and engagement and tradition of growing fruits, vegetables, of having their own allotments or their own access, however small it may have been, to have a food culture basically that is not just about consumption but is also about growing, that those communities are integrated in regeneration schemes or land use changes, or even thinking about, as I was mentioning, community restaurants. I think there's a real challenge there as these emerge of thinking about culturally appropriate foods. And by culturally appropriate foods, I don't just mean ingredients, but I'm talking about everything from the times that food are offered. Different cultures, thankfully, in London might have different understandings of when breakfast falls or how big breakfast might be. And also thinking of the kinds of spaces and occasions where food might play a role. I mentioned Ramadan because we're living through it right now, but these are the kinds of cultural appropriate sensitivities where city authorities, both public and private, might think about justice in that recognition form. I think for translocal networks, I'll be I don't know if this is controversial, but I'll be somewhat provocative, and I think that there's an issue here about these translocal networks proliferating and duplicating. So in some respects, the first and earliest expression was the Milan Pact for urban food policy, and many other cities have formed part of that network. But then there's also C40 network, and my colleague in the University of Barcelona has mapped this quite recently. Moragues Faus is the author, and she's outlined how there's a real richness of urban and translocal food networks. I think the danger here is that there's a duplication without multiplication, and that all these various initiatives don't add up to more than the sum of their parts, or worse, that they compete with each other. Because if there's one thing that, again, a notion of an urban food system points to, is the premium on the joined up thinking and the interconnectedness. The systemic side of things is there for the taking. It's put on a plate for us. Again, apologies for these terrible puns, but it really is there for the taking, insofar as once one understands how those millions of meals, as I was saying, that are eaten in public every day in a city like London, you immediately have to think about supply chains. You have to think about the places where that food is eaten. You have to think about packaging and waste, and about who clears up. You have to think about, where the food ends up. Toilets, for instance, who does the cleaning, what the access is to those kinds of public restrooms. All those kinds of things are integrated, and it seems to me that ideally that should be the case as well translocally, that we think, notwithstanding of the cultural differences between different cities, that we think about what are the commonalities. I'll say finally that this is something that I'm keen to try and begin to investigate in the work that I started out with Candan Türkan in Istanbul. Initially, we were looking at London and Istanbul and thinking, okay, these are very different places. But the more you look, the more there are patterns that are very comparable, obviously in terms of size, in terms of population, but in terms of history. Both have rich histories of public food provision from the peri-urban areas, rich histories of urban markets that are being transformed, of course, of all kinds of mixed ecologies of food provision, from small street markets, fruit and veg sellers that are slowly, still hanging in there, but are slowly dying out, like Ridley Road Market, say in North London, I suppose we can call it, or if East London, sorry, or in terms of the kinds of thinking more macro, the differences between, the similarities between Istanbul and London as both being on the edges of the European Union now, of the European continent, and with regard to policy, having to deal with the fact that they are so dependent on European markets and yet outside of them. They both incidentally have municipal food strategies. So there's all kinds of parallels there that I like to investigate eventually, to see how far the mayor's office in London and the metropolitan authorities in Istanbul, of course, are going through their own troubles as we speak now, how far they have a sense of potential collaborations.
Thanks, Alex. We have 2 more minutes and 1 more question. So I guess that might give you a sense of about how long you have to answer, but it's an interesting question. Do health professionals have a role in this just transition? If yes, how do we get them on board, especially considering how time poor they are?
Really good question. I'll try and keep it as short as possible. Again, I would start by saying that health professionals themselves are subject to forms of malnutrition. The Kevin Morgan book identifies nursing staff being obese, precisely partly because of the suffering obesity and other forms of mal or poor nourishment or poor eating practices, precisely because of the time constraints that you're talking about. So one immediate thing I would say is that we have to care about the carers themselves. And food is that everyday thing that we all hopefully do 3 times a day, where there can be a direct intervention. I think that the other thing, I only probably have 30 seconds here, is that there's definitely a nutritional dimension to health. And I don't for a minute want to elide that. I think it's critical, and nutritionist colleagues, that part of the health sector are central and have been, in fact, very important in thinking through aspects of this just transition. But part of what the more critical nutritionists have highlighted is that we should think about these phenomena as social phenomena. And what I mean by that is that we have to think of the whole person, and that person being part of a wider social infrastructure. And therefore, it's not necessarily about what you eat, but more often about where and how, at what time, in what time context, and with who. In other words, it's not just the nutritional aspects, the calories and the vitamins, important as those are, of course, for different parts of the life course, but it's also who you're eating with, when, and whether you have the time. I'll leave it at that. I think it's appropriately, given that we've got to close now. I think the time poverty aspects of our weekly routine habits are the real weak link at the minute.
Thanks so much, Alex. There were more questions, but I think, you've given, sometimes it's important to protect time as well, right? When people have given a lot of their time to an event, and also the audience have as well. So I have posted your I hope it's okay, but your staff profile on the Birkbeck website. So if there's been some questions in the Q&A around how this maps onto the Global South, which are obviously really important dimensions to this, but I feel that we'll have to wait. But I'm sure Alex wouldn't mind an email if there's a particular question that someone wants to ask. So, Alex, thank you very much for this important talk. I feel, all the talks we've had as part of the Climate Festival kind of shed a different perspective, or give a different light to the kind of global emergency we're living through. And I feel, along with energy and emotions and food, these are some really core things that we have to kind of grapple with, and it's a really essential part of the picture. So thank you so much for your time. I put in the chat as well that we have our final event of the Climate Festival tomorrow, running at 12:15 online, which is a kind of taste of our programs, where you can meet program directors and even some students who've been on courses. And it's a free event. If you have more questions about what it might be like to study at Birkbeck, or continue your studies, or even want to ask one of our program directors a question, it's a really great opportunity to do that. But for now, Alex, thank you very much. And thank you also to our audience.
Thank you all. Thank you, Stephen. See you again.
So I'm going to log off now. Bye, everyone.
Bye.